She was screaming so hard that the walls were shaking. And we just stood there, silent and waiting for the storm to pass. This time I couldn't take it anymore. I have been living with my father and his wife Agnes for just over a year now, ever since the end of 2022 when my dad decided it was time for us, me and my younger brother Nick, who's 16, to move in with her. I was 20 at the time, still adjusting to life after high school, trying to figure out my direction, and the move felt abrupt, like something we were pulled into rather than something we chose. My dad and Agnes got married not long after, in the early weeks of 2023, and everything about their relationship seemed fast, as if they were racing to start over, while Nick and I were still stuck trying to catch up. The house we moved into was nice, bigger than anything we'd lived in before, filled with polished furniture and scented candles and a kind of curated calm that never quite felt like home. Agnes was polite, overly so, the kind of woman who always smiled just a second too late and never raised her voice but somehow still made the air feel tight when she walked into the room. My dad seemed happy, at least on the surface, but even early on, there was this unspoken tension between all of us, like we were guests trying not to overstay our welcome in a house that technically belonged to all of us, but emotionally belonged to her. From the very beginning, there was a quiet but constant tension between Agnes and me, a subtle friction that never exploded outright but simmered beneath almost every interaction we had. She made it clear early on that she expected me and Nick to contribute to the housework, which in theory was completely fair. We were living there after all and sharing the space. But what quickly became hard to ignore was that while she assigned us endless lists of chores, vacuuming, scrubbing floors, dishes, laundry, she rarely lifted a finger herself. Whenever I pointed it out or even hesitated, she'd fall back on the same justification, saying that she was the one working full-time, that she was paying the rent and keeping the household running. But the truth was more complicated than that. My dad was covering most of the expenses, groceries, bills, and a good chunk of the rent too, while Agnes treated the house like her domain and us like uninvited tenants she tolerated out of obligation. She moved through the house like a manager, not a partner or stepmother, barking out orders and then retreating to her room or the sofa, always claiming exhaustion, always reminding us that she was the adult who provided. And no matter how hard I tried to keep the peace, the resentment grew quietly inside me, fed by every moment I scrubbed something while she sat scrolling on her phone, acting like I owed her gratitude for the roof over my head. When Agnes quit her job to take care of her mother and prepare to sell the apartment, I thought, naively perhaps, that things in the house might shift a little, that with her being home all the time, she'd start to share more of the responsibility or at least ease the pressure she constantly placed on me and Nick. But nothing really changed. She still delegated most of the household tasks to us, as if her presence didn't come with any added weight. And if anything, the imbalance became more obvious now that she was always around. She only helped with the housework when it directly benefited her, like when guests were coming over or when my dad would be home earlier than expected, or she'd launch into a sudden burst of aggressive cleaning, not out of routine or care, but as an outlet for her irritation. Those cleaning frenzies usually came after some minor inconvenience, and they were always loud, tense performances, filled with banging cabinet doors and exaggerated sighs, the kind that made the whole house feel on edge. It didn't feel like teamwork or even shared space. It felt like walking on glass, like every clean plate or folded blanket came with strings attached. And somehow, despite being home every day, she still made sure we knew that the labor of maintaining the house was ours, not hers. Agnes has repeatedly said, almost like a warning or an excuse, that she probably has bipolar disorder, though to my knowledge she's never been formally diagnosed or sought treatment. She brings it up when her behavior escalates, when her moods swing from indifferent to explosive with no real trigger, as if naming it in passing is supposed to justify the chaos that follows. She gets irritated over the smallest things, crumbs on the counter, a dish left in the sink, a pair of shoes by the door, and her reactions are far out of proportion, sometimes full-on hysterical, with raised voices and angry pacing that make the whole house feel unstable. Even when she isn't shouting in person, her text messages land with the same intensity. She'll fire off messages from the next room like, "Clean up this damn kitchen," laced with either rage or condescension depending on the day. It doesn't matter if the mess isn't mine or if I was already on my way to clean, it's about control, about making sure I know who's in charge. And every time I get one of those texts, it's like a jolt to the chest, a reminder that no matter how quiet I try to be, no matter how careful or respectful, it will never be enough to keep the peace. The worst part wasn't just the yelling or the constant criticism, it was the way Agnes openly admitted, more than once, that she never intended for us to live there for long, that this arrangement was always temporary in her mind, even though no one had said that when we moved in. She'd say it casually like it was just a fact, tossing it out in conversation or during one of her angry moods, that we'd have to move out soon, that she didn't plan on having grown kids in her space, that we needed to figure out our next steps. It was always phrased in a way that made it sound like we were the ones imposing, like we were squatters in a home that had never truly been ours. She acted as if the house belonged solely to her, as if my father's name on the lease or the bills he paid didn't matter, as if Nick and I were just extra weight she had agreed to carry out of politeness. And no matter how much we cleaned, how quiet we stayed, or how much we tried to avoid conflict, her tone always reminded us that we were temporary, that we didn't belong. It was the kind of subtle rejection that didn't need to be shouted to be felt. It lived in every cold glance, every slammed door, every passive-aggressive sigh that echoed through a house that never felt like home. One day I came back from a short trip, exhausted but ready to dive back into the rhythm of my routine, and almost immediately I found myself juggling my studies and work again, trying to catch up on everything I had missed. My dad and I had already talked about the house chores before I left, and we had agreed on a reasonable cleaning schedule. One that balanced my responsibilities without overwhelming me, one that respected the fact that I was working and studying full-time. For a little while, everything actually seemed to be going well. There were no angry texts, no outbursts, no sudden explosions over dust or dishes, and I started to think maybe we had reached a kind of quiet understanding. I followed the plan, stayed out of the way, and focused on getting through each day without upsetting the fragile peace we had managed to build. It felt fragile, yes, but it was something, and I was clinging to it. At lunchtime, I walked into the kitchen and saw that Nick had been cooking, the usual signs of his rushed meal scattered around, the cutting board still out, a few dishes in the sink and crumbs along the counter. Wanting to stay on top of things and avoid any unnecessary tension, I decided not to waste time and immediately cleaned up my part of the mess, wiping down the area I had used and putting away anything I had touched. Then, knowing it wasn't all mine to handle, I sent Nick a quick message asking him to take care of the rest when he had a break, figuring it was fair and in line with how we usually divided things. With that handled, I returned to my room and went back to studying, trying to refocus on the assignments piling up and the mental space I was already struggling to maintain, completely unaware that something as routine as a lunch cleanup was about to become yet another spark for conflict. A few minutes later, as I was trying to concentrate on my reading, a message popped up in our family group chat that made my stomach drop a little. It was from Agnes, and all it said was, "The kitchen is for you." There was no context, no greeting, just that cold, clipped sentence that immediately put me on edge. I stared at it for a moment, confused and slightly annoyed, then calmly replied that I had already cleaned everything that was mine and had asked Nick to take care of the rest since he had been the one cooking. I assumed that would be the end of it, a quick clarification that would clear up any misunderstanding, but instead of support or even acknowledgement, my dad chimed in with a short, dismissive response, "Talk to your brother." No defense, no attempt to mediate, just a quiet exit from the conversation that left me feeling abandoned and suddenly very alone in the middle of yet another petty power struggle. It turned out that after I had gone back to studying, Agnes was the one who came into the kitchen, saw the mess that Nick had left behind, and immediately began yelling at him, not bothering to ask who was responsible or what had already been taken care of. I didn't even know it had escalated until I pieced it together later, after reading my dad's vague message and seeing the tension unfold like it always did, passive, sharp, and misdirected. Wanting to clear things up, I went downstairs to explain the situation, thinking it would be a simple conversation, just setting the record straight that I had already cleaned my part and had responsibly asked Nick to handle his. But instead of a calm discussion, we were both summoned like children into the living room, called to the carpet, not for resolution but for reprimand. Agnes stood there with her arms crossed, eyes sharp and ready, while my dad sat silently beside her, the quiet accomplice to whatever lecture was about to come. There was no room for explanation, no interest in understanding, only judgment, accusations, and that same suffocating atmosphere that always made it clear that in her house, our voices didn't carry equal weight. I asked as calmly as I could, if I could explain everything without being interrupted, because I genuinely wanted to clear the air and avoid another pointless argument. They both nodded, my dad with a tired look in his eyes and Agnes with her arms folded, giving a tight, silent nod that didn't exactly feel sincere. I barely got a minute into explaining, just beginning to walk through what actually happened, that I had cleaned up my part and messaged Nick about the rest, when Agnes cut me off mid-sentence. She didn't just interrupt, she exploded, her voice rising fast and sharp as she shouted that she didn't care who was to blame, that it wasn't about fairness or explanation. She said with absolute finality, "This is my house and it will be as I say," her voice trembling not with emotion but with control. And in that moment, it became painfully clear that this wasn't about dishes or responsibility or even respect. It was about power. It didn't matter what had actually happened or how reasonable I was trying to be. The rules would always shift in her favor, and we were just expected to obey without question. I couldn't hold it in anymore. The shouting, the accusations, the complete disregard for anything I was trying to say, it all became too much, and I broke down right there in the middle of the living room, crying in front of them both while Agnes kept yelling like my tears were just another inconvenience to deal with. Her voice rose higher with every word, as if my pain only fueled her fury, and I stood there frozen, trying to speak but unable to breathe past the tightness in my chest. My dad, finally shaken out of his passivity, raised his voice for the first time in what felt like forever, telling her that this wasn't the way to behave, that yelling like this wasn't acceptable. But his words were too little, too late, and something in me snapped under the weight of everything I had been holding in. Through my tears I shouted back at her, my voice shaking but clear, "You are toxic." The words hung in the air for a split second, heavy and irreversible, and then she completely lost it. She exploded with even more rage, louder than before, her face red and trembling, shouting things I couldn't even fully hear over the pounding in my head. And as I stood there crying, I realized that no matter how many times we tried to talk things through, the outcome would always be the same. Her screaming, my silence, and my father watching, unable, or unwilling, to choose a side. I went straight to my room, trembling and exhausted, trying to catch my breath and shut out the chaos that was still echoing from the living room. But even with the door closed, I could hear her voice clearly, shouting, sharp and cutting, as she screamed that if I didn't like the way things were, I could just pack my things and leave. Her words hit like a slap, not surprising but still deeply painful, and I sat on the edge of my bed, frozen in place, listening to the way she reduced my existence in that house to something optional, something she was barely tolerating. Then I heard my dad speak, his voice low but firm for once, saying, "He lives here," like he was reminding her of a fact she had chosen to ignore. There was a pause, and then her reply came, cold and unwavering, "Then let him go." It was so casual, so indifferent, like tossing me out was nothing more than removing an unwanted piece of furniture. And in that moment, I knew with absolute clarity that this wasn't a home, it was a battlefield, and I had never really been welcome in it. Later that evening, my dad came into my room, his face tired and lined with the kind of tension that had become all too familiar, and he sat down like he didn't really want to have the conversation but knew he had to. He told me gently but clearly that I shouldn't have used the word toxic, that calling someone that, especially someone he was married to, was hurtful and unproductive, and that it only made things worse. He said he understood I was upset, but that words like that could do lasting damage. But I didn't back down. I told him, calmly but firmly, that I hadn't used the word lightly or to be cruel. I used it because that's exactly what it was. I told him how she shouts when things don't go her way, how she manipulates conversations to make us feel guilty or small, how she never misses a chance to remind us we don't belong. I told him how her presence has turned our home into a place where we never feel safe or relaxed, where even the smallest misstep turns into a storm. And I looked him in the eye and asked, "What else am I supposed to call it when someone constantly disturbs our peace just to remind us we're not welcome?" He didn't have an answer. He just sat there in silence, and for the first time, I think he finally understood I wasn't speaking out of anger, I was speaking out of survival. The next day, my dad, my brother, and I went grocery shopping together, a small escape from the heaviness of the house, and while we were walking through the aisles, I finally said what I had been holding in for far too long. I looked at him and told him straight out that if I were in his shoes, I would have ended the relationship by now, because no peace, no stability, and certainly no love was worth what we had all been living with under that roof. He didn't respond right away, just kept pushing the cart, his jaw tight, and for a moment I thought he might brush it off the way he usually did, with tired deflection and vague neutrality. But then he said quietly that he had given her a chance to change, that he had hoped things would get better, that maybe the chaos was just part of the adjustment, and that deep down he believed she could soften with time. I listened, but I couldn't help the ache that rose in my chest because from where I stood, from what I had seen and lived and absorbed over the past year, I hadn't witnessed any real change at all. Only excuses, explosions, and a cycle that always ended with us picking up the pieces while she walked away untouched. And as I looked at him, trying to reconcile the man I respected with the one choosing to stay in a situation that hurt his children, I realized that love, no matter how well-intentioned, can sometimes make people ignore the damage right in front of them. In the evening, the three of us sat down for a long, difficult conversation, the kind that had been avoided for too long but could no longer be put off. The tension in the room was heavy, the kind that makes your chest feel tight even before a single word is spoken, but I knew I had to be honest. I told my dad, clearly and without hesitation, that Nick and I didn't feel safe in that house anymore. Not physically threatened but emotionally worn down, constantly walking on eggshells, waiting for the next explosion or accusation to erupt out of nowhere. I explained that this wasn't just about household chores or communication. It was about the environment we were being forced to live in, one that drained us and left no room for comfort or peace. I said that if nothing changed, if Agnes continued treating us like unwanted guests instead of family, then there would be no future in that house with all of us under the same roof. Either she would leave or Nick and I would have to. There was no threat in my voice, just exhaustion and truth. My dad listened in silence for a long moment, and then finally nodded. He promised that he would talk to her seriously this time and give her a clear ultimatum, something he had avoided doing for too long. I could tell it weighed on him, but for the first time in a long while, it felt like he understood the damage that had already been done and the cost of continuing to ignore it.